Okay, it's time. Hello and welcome to another episode of our events. Today it's called What Happened to Renewable Energy? And joining me today is our beloved Paolo von Schirach. He is the president of Global Policy Institute and the chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department of Bay Atlantic University. Hello, Paolo.
Hi, Cenk. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you today. Today, we're going to be talking about renewable energy and the climate crisis that surrounds the last several months. Basically, as a part of the conference in Glasgow, Scotland, it was top of the agenda. We are trying to commonly find a way to save the planet, save lives, and make sure that the globe is not going to burn down to the ground in the next couple of 100 years. I'd like to start by asking Paolo, and Paolo is the right person to talk about this because he is an expert on energy issues all around the world. He worked in many places, including Africa, where it's a very serious problem, the climate change and the overpopulation and air pollution and development as well. So, Paolo, I want to start by asking you about one of the statements of the recent summit and the conference. And it's as follows, that the climate change is the greatest risk facing us all. What do you say about that? Is it really the greatest risk facing us all, and are we doomed?
Is it a risk? Yes. Is it the greatest, ranked worldwide? It depends whom you ask. Since you mentioned developing countries and Africa, if you ask the average African and you say, what is the greatest risk? What is the greatest problem you're facing? It's poverty, not climate change. And so that change shows you a little bit of different perspectives on how people view their own circumstances based on where they live, how they live. And extreme poverty, I would say, is a very big risk for, or at least a hardship for the people who are experiencing it. And 600 million Africans have no energy at all. Forget about clean or unclean. So, but if we try to understand the Glasgow statement, it's part of a narrative that we are sort of, at least some of us, are used to. There is a realization that came already many years ago that the continuous burning of fossil fuels, primarily coal, natural gas, and petroleum, that is oil, which we use, all of us, gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel when we take, a flight going anywhere, ship fuel for ships, and on, that doing this consistently for now maybe a century or more, that we've been doing this, and in larger and larger volumes, has an unwanted byproduct. And the byproduct is that in the activity of burning these fuels, we release into the atmospheres emissions of greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases have the unfortunate property of trapping the heat from the sun, which does not get released back into the atmosphere. And this is called the greenhouse effect, which means that down the line, what we have obtained is not particularly dramatic for us lay people, increase in global temperatures. How much is that? 1 degree Celsius or more? We say, oh, come on, that can't be that much. Well, yes, it is. It is enough to cause what, all scientists warn us against, which is global warming. Global warming brings along all kinds of unwanted effects, including extreme weather temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what we are told. This is really catastrophic. Not yet today, but if we continue to do things pretty much the way we have, by continuing to rely heavily on fossil fuels, down the line, we're going to cook up the planet, and it will be literally unsuitable for human life.
In fact, today we're seeing a lot of changes in the climate, including storms and floods and wildfires and increased air pollution that affects all of us. Is renewable energy a response? I mean, it's a response to it, but is it an effective one? Is it the only tool that we can use? And how effective is this?
Well, that's the great question, and this is our topic for today, right? Renewable energy. What is the beauty of renewable energy? That it is emissions-free. In other words, if you substitute as a form of power generation, if you look at solar panels or wind towers, they don't burn anything, and therefore they are emissions-free. And that means they do not have the unwanted side effect of the action of burning fossil fuels to power our economies by the means that we've been used to. I repeat, coal, natural gas, and oil. So here's the thing: renewable energy does exist. The technologies supporting it, mostly solar and wind, have improved substantially in the last several years. The costs of production, the entire life cycle, the production of the items, the deployment, etc., has gone down substantially. The problem is that it's not yet comparable if you do a side-by-side comparison with the cost and effectiveness of fossil fuels. So here's the problem. Is this anyway the thing we must do, regardless of economic considerations? Because we are, as some people say, in an emergency situation. If you accept that this is an emergency, well, then anything is better than nothing, right? And even if it's not perfect, even if it's not completely polished and refined, you do it anyway because that's all you've got.
So keep this at the corner right now. Let me ask you this: what did the nations decide to do at Glasgow, and how compatible is this to the efforts that you've been talking about?
Look, here's the thing: the Glasgow summit, which was just the latest COP,
26.
The 26th. So
yeah.
So this is a conversation that has engaged, which the international community has been engaged in for decades. Here's the thing: the format, the way in which this agreement, this effort to combat climate change, global agreement works, is that countries come up with their own goals, right? They say, okay, I commit to do this. Our country will reduce emissions by X by the year, whatever. And that's a voluntary commitment. Two things. If you sum everything up and you say, well, this is the commitment of Germany, this is the commitment of South Korea, this is the commitment of Guatemala, this is the commitment of Turkey, this is the commitment of Algeria. Fine. And you put them all together and you say, okay, assume that everybody does what they're supposed to do according to their voluntary statements. How much do we obtain in terms of reduced emissions? First question. Second question is, what impact will these reduced emissions have on this unfortunate trend towards global warming? And here, unfortunately, the outcome of this analysis is not particularly promising, because the commitments made by countries, and we have to assume that they will be achieved, okay? Mm-hmm. Even if they are achieved, will they actually do the trick? And the answer is not so much, because in order to do the trick, you've got to go to zero, and then actually negative, because
which is impossible.
It's possible only if you assume gigantic scrubbing machinery which, by the way, some people are working on to remove from the atmosphere the greenhouse gases, mostly CO2 and methane, that have already been released. Because to the extent that they are there, even if we go down to zero tomorrow, which is impossible, but assume we can, what's already out there contributes to augment global warming anyway. So we got to, in order to reverse this thing that is described as an existential crisis, we would have to go down to zero, not just reduce emissions, but go down to zero, all of us. That means the United States, China, India, Brazil, Europe, South Africa, Australia, Indonesia, you name it, go down to zero in the shortest period of time, and then reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere.
Let's talk about slowing this down, and how does renewable energy come into play in that sense?
Well, that's the only tool we've got right now. Well, not the only, but the principal tool that we've got in the toolbox. Because renewable energy, as we discussed a moment ago, has the wonderful feature of being, at least in the production of a renewable energy, to be emissions free.
Is it a holy grail?
Well, it could be. The problem is that it is imperfect. That is, while the technologies have improved substantially and the prices have gone down quite substantially, it's not yet cost effective. Look, if it were cost effective, and forget about the whole debate that that is a kind of a, it's the context in which this conversation is taking place. That is, we've got global warming. That is a real problem. What is our solution? Renewable energy. Okay, this is how sort of in simplified terms, how the conversation has been framed. But forget about global warming for a moment. Let's talk about industrial innovation anyway, which we are engaged in everything, whether it's about toothpaste or nicer toys, better automobiles, better performing software or whatever.
We need technology for renewable energy.
That's right. But the point is this, renewable energy, can it stand on its own feet today? In other words, you and I, the generic consumers, or let's say we both of us run an electric utility or whatever, or we want to produce electricity that will be bought by an electric utility. Are we going to choose renewable energy simply because it's better, because it's more efficient, more cost effective, cheaper, easier to produce, easier to deliver today, standing on the merit of the technology? Probably not. Why? Because, as I said, it is expensive, relatively speaking, and not very efficient. Renewable energy is intermittent. Okay, let's explain. It's very simple. The sun doesn't shine at night. Okay, so if you rely on electricity produced by solar panels, at night you have no electricity because at the moment there is no storage capacity. It sounds pretty mystifying. So, come on, we don't have storage capacity. What about batteries? Don't I use batteries for my phone or for my gadgets, for my, whatever, hair dryer or whatever I may need? The answer is yes. Do we have batteries? Yes. Do we have batteries that can be produced in the size and scale that could contain enough energy to tie you over in the many hours of the day in which, or night, I should say, in the case of solar, and the day regarding wind, because the wind it's irregular. It's not constant. So sometimes there is no wind or there's not enough wind. And so how do you power your stuff if you don't have the electricity? Well, then you need backup systems and on and on. So it's complicated, but the point is that this technology, as promising as it is still imperfect. So the reason why it is now more widely adopted is because governments, including the United States government, are essentially forcing the adoption by mandating that electrical utilities, for instance, must purchase at least a percentage of the electricity that they then distribute to the end users, like everybody watching and listening to us today, and you and I, Cenk. It has to be done by law. And by the same token, in some instances, production of this electricity is incentivized through subsidies. And by the same token, the production of fossil fuels is penalized in some fashion. So basically, by government intervention, there is a forced adoption of the good stuff, because the good
Is it
stuff,
bad?
well, it is not. Well, again, if you stick to the initial assumption, that is, it is a crisis, well, then you do what the doctor ordered, right? You do what the doctor ordered, whether you like it or not. The cure may be painful or may be unpleasant, but otherwise you're dead, right? It's as simple as that. If you accept that assumption. If you do not accept that assumption, well, then it's a tax. And the tax ultimately paid by whom? By the consumer. Because to the extent that what's introduced in the marketplace is more expensive electricity, ultimately, we are those who pay the bill. Directly.
What happens if the cure does not fit the bill, like our wallet? Not all the nations of the world are capable of employing such measures to force their communities to do it, because one of the terms of the summit in Glasgow, or Paris Agreement in general, is to make the developed nations secure funding of up to $100 billion to support the underdeveloped nations to convert to renewable energy, to sustainable renewable energy. And they couldn't do that. And I have my doubts, even if they do that, it will be sufficient. What do you think about that?
Woefully insufficient. I mean, the rest of the world is billions of people who either have bad energy production, which is usually reliant on coal, which is the worst form of electricity, fuel for electricity generation in terms of its emissions. It's absolutely the worst. Or don't have anything at all. There's more than 1 billion people in Africa. About 600 million people there have no electricity at all, nothing. That means that they are condemned to perpetual underdevelopment, because quite frankly, clean or dirty without energy, you don't do anything else. Okay, think about it. You can't. There's nothing much you can do without energy in terms of sustainable economic development. So, $100 billion, yeah, nice. Sounds like a nice number, but it's woefully inadequate. Before, we were talking earlier, Cenk, before this webinar, about South Africa, a country that I know fairly well because I work there. South Africa is by African standards, a fairly developed economy by African standards. And it is almost entirely reliant on coal in terms of electricity generation. Well, and including, by the way, very recent state-of-the-art new major investments in augmenting the electricity generation capacity, simply because what they've got is inadequate in terms of quantity. Well, if South Africa would have to commit to do away with everything that they've got, which is reliant on coal, and adopt renewable energy based on their own estimates, the South African government, they would need a subsidy from the international community of at least $18 billion. All right. So you said 100 billion, right? South Africa alone would take 18 billion of that, assuming that people would agree and that this happens, which is very unlikely. But that gives you a sense that since there are at least another 100 countries that would be eligible to these financial aid in order to convert from dirty energy or no energy at all to clean energy, that's an impossibility. You would need a lot more than that, considering also that the population growth, which also means higher demand for energy, takes place or will take place, is projected to take place mostly, as it were, in Africa, which is poor as it is today, even though situation is improving in many countries. But what I'm trying to say, that the countries that will have the biggest growth in power generation and distribution demand are also those that will see the higher population growth. So these numbers are inadequate.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about coal, because I guess it's the complete opposite of renewable energy. And ironically, it's the main pillar of how underdeveloped countries are going to be using to join the developed club. So, and that's what is expected from them, to actually join the renewable energy and the clean energy sort of group of countries. So isn't it a vicious circle that we ask the underdeveloped to work on their economy, their society, their education all around, and then they will have the conscience to get to the next level so that they convert themselves to a more environmentally friendly state?
That's right. I mean, to be environmentally conscious and to try to be green is, as of today, it's a bit of a luxury. It's a luxury that the United States and Europe and and other, say, Australia or Canada, other countries that have reached a certain level of Japan, other countries that have reached a certain level can afford. Poor countries, unfortunately, don't have this luxury. They are trying to desperately to climb out of poverty. And for that, as we all agree, I mean, we need energy, and preferably reliable and affordable. If the energy is not reliable, is not affordable, then it's a luxury that they cannot, that's not particularly useful to them. In fact, if I may, just to digress a little bit, California, okay, which is America. And when we think California, we think of what? The best of the best, Silicon Valley, the future, venture capitalists, the major tech companies in the world, blah, blah, blah. Well, it also happens now to have the highest energy costs in the United States, because they've introduced so many mandates in order to be green. And guess what? California now is the country that has the highest level of poverty in the United States. Now, is there a direct correlation between the two? Some people may argue, no, that's pure coincidence. But the reality is this, that when you increase energy costs, who gets hit first? The poor, right? It's a regressive tax in a sense, meaning if your utility bills go up, well, if you're in the middle class or upper middle class, you can absorb that hit. Okay, say electricity is going to cost you $30, $40, $50 more a month. It's unpleasant, but you can take it. If you are poor and you can hardly make ends meet, well, that's a real problem, because that means you can't work. It doesn't work for you. Because your electricity cost eats from your modest disposable income that you need literally to buy food or other basic necessities. So this is in California. Imagine Africa, imagine parts of India, imagine parts of Latin America. So here, the dilemma here is this: can the developed world engineer a massive, and it will really have to be massive, program of investments and support for the developing countries to help them transition away from dirty energy, and also introduce at scale renewable energy that will really help them to advance in their efforts to become more prosperous? That's a great idea. I am not quite sure that we've got the resources, the political will, the ability to coordinate and properly implement something of this magnitude.
I see. That brings us to the political side of the problem. Actually, this seems like a tripod of having governments and businesses and civil society on three corners of the issue. And it requires that not only all of these work in harmony, but at the same time, nations of the world working in collaboration with each other, which is nowadays not very easy based on what we see, not on an environmental level, but on like the international crisis situations. So how do you see the international climate in terms of political relations to contribute or harm the efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change?
Well, that's a very a good point and a very unfortunate one. Let's take the obvious, the proverbial elephant in the room. That's China. Okay, China has 1.4 billion people. It is by now it's the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, having overtaken the United States a few years ago. On a per capita basis, the United States is still the worst offender, simply because we Americans use a lot of energy, probably waste a lot of it. And so on a per capita basis, we are the worst offenders. But in the totality of emissions, which is what really counts when you look at global warming, is China. China is not even part of the conversation, really, because they've made pledges to start doing something several years from now. Well, thank you. Will they? Will they not? We don't even know that. So in other words, at the moment, they are not even committed to anything much except rather distant targets in which they will start, reducing emissions. And probably by that time, whoever is in office, in government here in the United States, in other countries, will be long gone, probably dead, and therefore it doesn't really matter. If you say, oh yeah, 20 years from now, I'm going to do this. Interesting, but is that a binding commitment? Who knows? And if we look at the reality, China used to be almost totally reliant on coal-fired plants for electricity generation. We're talking about 80%. The United States at its peak was about 40%, and now it's declining. In the United States, by the way, why is reliance on coal diminishing substantially? Because of global warming concerns? No, simply because natural gas that we've discovered that we have in superabundance due to shale deposits is cheaper and more cost-effective than coal. In other words, we've shifted away from coal to natural gas, which happens to be cleaner, relatively speaking, not because people are nice and green, but because it makes good economic sense. Close parenthesis. Back to China. They rely still very heavily on coal, even though they say now they're diminishing reliance. And truth be told, China is also one of the leaders in the renewable energy technologies, particularly solar panels. So it's not that they're not doing anything, but if you look at the total mix that they have, they continue to have coal-fired plants. They're not phasing them out. And also, considering the impact that China has on other emerging countries, China continues to export the technology to build coal-fired plants in emerging countries. So are they part of the solution or part of the problem? Well, you tell me. It doesn't seem to be, the most constructive behavior so far. And if you add to this the unfortunate development, which is completely extraneous to our conversation, which is a veritable new Cold War that has manifested itself and it's going to stay with us for a long time, in which there is a really a series of unresolved issues between the United States and China on a variety of matters that go way beyond global warming. They go to geopolitical influence, trading practices, stealing intellectual property, taking over territories and islands in the South China Sea, and on and on and on. This is not what we're talking about today. These matters that divide the United States and China are not going to be resolved anytime soon. And ideally, to tackle global warming, you would need close agreement and cooperation between what are the two biggest polluters, the United States and China. That agreement is not happening.
And it seems like this is an agenda item that could be tackled in the time of peace, not in the time of like the tensions and war. When it comes to when the time comes to deal with tensions and wars and cold wars and whatnot, then all the things related to climate or environment are suddenly inferior, right?
That's right. And also, but take another major player in this whole scenario, Russia. Okay, the size of the Russian economy is not that substantial. Therefore, their emissions are in proportion to the level of industrial development and what have you. However, as most of us know, Russia is one of the one of the two major exporters in the world, with Saudi Arabia, of guess what? Fossil fuels. If you're saying let's do away with fossil fuels tomorrow, well, that means Russia has no economy. How's that? Because their wealth, their revenue generation capacity comes from the money they make by selling to the rest of the world large amounts of oil and natural gas. That's how they make money, because they don't really have a lot more than that. If Russia says, oh my God, our oil and gas really bad, oh, we're going to stop exporting it tomorrow because we want to save the planet. Sure. And then what are you going to tell 160 million Russians? Sorry, guys, you don't eat because you have to be green. Okay. Is that workable? I don't think so.
Yeah, makes sense. So far, here is what we have. There is a real threat ahead of us, and there is no confusion about that. And there is a proposed solution that we can pursue, which is not 100% guaranteed to solve the problems, but it is actually it is in fact like at least something in that direction. But unfortunately, there are more pressing issues for both the individuals and the countries themselves, the governments themselves. So it seems like a deadlock for the globe to be saved with a mutual, like the collaborative effort. So what would you see as the proper way of acting at this point, where you know that there is a threat, there is no clear solution, only a hope through one direction? What would you suggest that these individuals and countries to pursue in the short term?
Look, again, I am certainly not the one who came up with an alternative, approach to all this. Some people argue that, yes, is global warming serious? You bet it is. Is it man-made? You bet it is. Is it due to the burning of fossil fuels? Yes. I don't think this is controversial. This is not, of course, some would say, no, it's not true. This is all a plot from the left or whatever, These are all the green environmentalists who made up this whole story. It's not true. And then, of course, you're a climate denier and this and that. But I would say responsible people who look at the data, the scientists, would agree on these basic points.
That's the science part, but then comes the but part.
Yes, but here's the thing. Then saying, okay, is this a problem? Yes. Is this necessarily the biggest problem facing humanity? Well, then, some people would say no, because they would say, yes, it's real. And we are facing this issue of rising global temperatures. However, they would say there are other ways of tackling the problem, such as what? Mitigation and adaptation, meaning it is really impossible in the short and medium term to successfully tackle emissions with what we've got. As I said before, the COP26 Glasgow, as the latest of many, many other global gatherings discussing global warming, hasn't really advanced the ball that much. Yes, there are pledges, there are commitments, and some good things will be done, etc. But does that move the needle substantially? The answer is no. Our ability to scale up the deployment of these still imperfect renewable energy technologies, mostly solar and wind, we can do that, but is that going to do the trick? No, not in the short and medium term, based on the level of development of the technologies. So do we just say, okay, we just drop the subject because nothing can be done? No, much can be done, hopefully constructively. And that is massive investment, which has been proposed by many, including Bill Gates, who is that's not his background, but he's now become an active participant in this conversation. He wrote a book about it. He has a company that he controls with others that is involved 100% in investing in research for alternative energy solutions. So he's not a climate denier at all, but he says, boy, this is a very, very steep hill to climb. We don't have what it takes as of today, but that doesn't mean we're done. Ingenuity, innovation, more research is possible and is highly recommended, in the sense that by trying this and trying that, you may try 200 different things, and maybe one or two can be real breakthroughs in stuff that maybe we don't even think about today. I mean the general public, the non-experts. And that may hold the promise of a solution or a better solution down the line. That's one area. Other areas, as many have said, is mitigation and adaptation, meaning, okay, let's accept the fact the world is indeed becoming warmer. That's a fact. Does that mean we're all dead? No. There are many things that can be done to mitigate the impact of global warming. Say, for instance, agricultural research that produces seeds for plants that are drought resistant, okay, that can survive in very harsh climate. It can be done. Again, I am not an agronomist, and I don't know exactly what it takes, to do this and that and the other. But many changes and developments have already occurred in this critical area, because that's food. That's what people need to eat. So can we do that? Probably yes. Other issues include, for instance, rising sea levels. Why are sea levels rising? Well, because the ice in the North Pole and South Pole and Greenland is slowly but surely melting down. That means there's more water. Water has more volume than ice. That means slowly but surely sea levels are rising. And projections indicate that if we just watch this happening and do nothing about it, significant parts of the world will be flooded in hundreds of years. But that's the trend. Do we just watch this and do nothing? No, there are many things that can be done. The Netherlands is a country whose surface is about 35% below sea level, okay? They've been battling the sea for hundreds of years, way before any conversation about rising sea levels due to global warming ever even entered, the thinking of anybody. Do they know a thing or two about how to protect endangered or threatened pieces of their rather small real estate, from the sea? Yes, they do. Can we learn from them? Yes, we can. Do we have examples of interventions that have provided better protection from natural disasters, that hit vulnerable areas? Yes. New Orleans, take New Orleans here in the United States. It was devastated by a horrible, Category 5 hurricane, Katrina, back in 2005. Why was it devastated? Because the protections that existed at that time, again, New Orleans, it's a bit like the Netherlands. Some of it is in a depression. That is, if water comes in, there's no outflow. Okay, it stays there, it floods the place. So there are protections and dikes and seawalls and pumps and what have you. They were just simply woefully insufficient. And so that hurricane was a disaster. Fast forward to today, a similar hurricane hit New Orleans and nothing major happened. Why? Because over the years, there have been interventions. The seawalls have been, fortified, made taller, this and that and the other, new pumping stations and whatever. And as a result, come another major weather event, like the hurricane we just had, and New Orleans was not flooded, which means engineering solutions worked. So does that mean, oh, we're done? No, we're not done, because that means that on a sustained pace in the United States, in South America, in India, in Europe, etc., governments, the private sector, local governments, whatever, will have to get busy to plan ahead and to say, okay, we're facing this problem. How can we, based on the technologies and the tools that we know and have today, is there something we can do about it? And the answer is yes. And by the way, to the extent that economic development occurs and more resources become available, there will be more money available to invest in this mitigation and adaptation solutions. Is that perfect? No, it's not. The perfect solution would be to go to zero emissions and then subtract the amount of greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. Maybe one day we'll get to it. These scrubbing machinery that may literally suck the CO2 away from the atmosphere are being tested as we speak today, but they are prohibitively expensive, so they cannot be deployed today at scale. So in the meantime, let's do something to adjust humanity to the unfortunately negative, mostly negative impact of global warming by beefing up our defenses. Look, in Qatar and Kuwait and the Emirates in the Arabian Peninsula, life would probably be impossible. Urban life, when you have temperatures of 45 degrees Celsius, and yet Dubai is a thriving metropolis of planetary proportions, a great hub for finance, travel, trade, this and that and the other. Why? Because they've got air conditioning, right? Simple as that. And how do they have air conditioning? Because they've got plenty of energy that is relatively cheap that can power the air conditioning equipment in practically every building, every home, every shop, every other place where people need to use in order to live there. So a place that would look very inhospitable, given its harsh climate, which is now probably getting worse due to increased global temperatures, is a thriving world metropolis, right? I'm not saying every country becomes Dubai tomorrow, but that stands out as an example of what can
but also
be
which
done.
is not very environmentally friendly, right?
That's right. But here it is. They are surviving there in a very inhospitable region of the world because they've got the money to build the countermeasures, if you wish, one of them being massively deployed air conditioning systems that make life possible. So I'm not saying, oh, no problem, let's put air conditioning in every hut, in every village in Africa. Well, that's not going to happen, quickly. But what I'm trying to say is that there are ways to mitigate the impact of global warming and adapt to the new circumstances, and at the same time invest heavily in new technologies that maybe will bring us better solutions, including the upgrading of what we already have, which is wind and solar, the renewable energy that is the subject of our conversation today.
I wanted to go back to there. Please hold that thought. Let's go back to talking about renewable energy. At that point, we have a question from the audience to you. You've been indicating that the only solution for global warming right now seems to be the renewable energy, which is not efficient nor cheap. If so, how come this renewable energy concept is still relevant? I think this has something to do with what you were about to say.
It's still relevant because that's all we've got. It is really all we've got. What have we got? We've got renewable energy. And we know it works. It is being deployed in some places on very large scale. In some countries, smaller countries, it already provides the majority, or at least a very substantial, percentage of the total energy production and distribution. So, this is what we've got, and therefore it's a natural that we talk about it. My hope is, as an observer, not as a practitioner, but as an observer, is that these technologies will be improved substantially, so that they, in the end, carry their own weight. That is, that they will be adopted willingly by end users, regardless of any concern about global warming, regardless of any desire to obtain subsidies, tax breaks, and other incentives at all. If it is better, we'll use it, right? And to the extent that more can be invested in the improvement of the technologies or other ancillary component of the cycle, such as reliable, cost-effective storage capacity via batteries or equivalent tools, whereby the renewable energy production is continuous, uninterrupted 24/7, well, that would already be a huge improvement on the cost effectiveness of the technology. So all this is work in progress. To say, oh, I'm against renewable energy is a dumb thing to say. We have to be for it, but I don't think that it would be wise to say this is the perfect solution, and that the only obstacle to its massive adoption is the resistance of the evil guys. I mean, the oil companies and what have you, the lobbies that prevent the massive adoption of renewable energy, which is already there. That's an oversimplified, way of looking at this, which doesn't really, help the conversation much. We need innovation in energy, for sure. If nothing else, for the reason that, fossil fuels, even though we got a lot of them, are a finite resource. Eventually, I don't know when that will be, we'll run out of them, because it's a finite resource. We cannot make more oil. We will use all the oil that we can find, and there's probably more than we thought. But in the end, it's a finite resource. So it is smart anyway, regardless of any other consideration, to look into the future at alternative resources. But by staying within this, our topic, which is what are we going to do about global warming, renewable energy? Well, yes, we've got to continue to invest in renewable energy technologies in order to make them better, more cost effective.
I understand that these efforts are going to be employed by the leading industrialized countries of the world. And that brings us to the second question of Telman Altan-Shagai, and she is mentioning that the government's priority in the world is not always global warming everywhere. And what about the burden sharing of this mutual problems? So how it's going to be that the countries who take it seriously deal with everything? And let me add something to it, that how can it be possible that the rest of the world will be on this train as well?
Look, that's a question of the convergence of policy priorities, and so it all depends on how serious you think all this is, and indeed, as we already discussed earlier, for some countries, certainly global warming would not be the number one issue on their to-do list. Poverty reduction is certainly a higher priority. The creation of and the delivery of, say, basic education will be or healthcare will be on their to-do list. Global warming would not be the number 2, 3, 4, probably maybe not even the number 10 issue. Okay, so that's the way it is, and to say, oh no, you really have to understand that this must be your priority. It's a bit presumptuous, because we have the luxury, as we were saying earlier, to deal with this, because we're not here trying to make a living. We are trying to prevent some catastrophic scenario from happening that we believe is likely if we take no action. But and we, even though in an imperfect way, we can afford to fund some of the technical replacements, which are renewable energy solutions, but other countries simply cannot. And already, repeating what we said earlier, Cenk, can the developed world massively subsidize the adoption of renewable energy technologies as they exist today, for the benefit of emerging countries? I doubt it. That would be necessary, but I doubt that that's possible.
I see. So it brings us to another elephant in the room, the overpopulation. The more we are as human beings on this planet, the more it makes difficult to solve the problems, right?
Correct. And again, the most of the population growth as projected will take place in the countries that are least prepared to face it, because they already face enormous challenges. And that will be mostly in Africa, which already today is well over 1 billion people. I'm not sure exactly what the number is, 1.1, 1.2 billion. And that's projected almost to double in the next few years. And that means more people and more demand for energy. And that is, if we have a problem today, in terms of scale, it will be much bigger, because you will have to deploy more electricity generation capacity, in substantially more than what we have today. So it better be efficient. If it's not efficient, well, then we have a cost issue that will have to be absorbed by somebody. And if it's not the countries themselves, because they don't have the money to do it, well, then it will have to be subsidized by the international community. And that, if it's already unlikely that the commitments made today will be met, imagine later on.
My last question, can we have high quality, high growth with renewable energy as where we are right now?
Well, can we have growth? Yes, but it will be slower growth, because the cost of energy impacts everything else. And to the extent that energy, the new form of energy adopted is more expensive compared to what we had, the bad stuff that we're used to, well, that will be reflected in the cost of everything else. Because if a manufacturing plant has a higher energy bill, well, they'll pass it on to whom? To those who buy their products. And eventually this trickles down to you and I when we go to the store and buy whatever that has been produced using energy, and that will be a little bit more expensive. And to the extent that that means the economy is less efficient. How much are we willing to sacrifice in terms of rates of growth in order to benefit the planet? That's
the real question.
But that's essentially a political question. Rich countries can grow, say, I don't know, let's say 1.2% a year. If that 1.2% becomes 1.1 or maybe 0.9, is that a disaster for a rich country? No, it's not. But it's less than optimal. But for poorer countries, if they need a rate of growth of 6, 7, 8% a year to really make progress in order to become developed, and you tell them, oh, sorry, you will have to wait a little bit longer, maybe a generation or two, because we got to tackle global warming first. And so your energy costs are going to be much higher, and therefore your rates of growth will be negatively affected. But hey, that's what we do to stop global warming. That may be a trade-off that they're unwilling to make.
With that, I'd like to thank you so much for talking about renewable energy today as a part of our series of what happens to various things that has the potential to influence our world that we live right now. I'm Cenk Karatas. I'm with Global Policy Institute. And again, thanks to Professor Paolo von Schirach for his insights. I hope to see you again in another episode of What Happened to series. Thank you so much. Thank you,
you.
Paolo.
Good to see you, Cenk.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.